Hey, what's up everyone? My name is William and today we're going to be going over the velocity processor MIDI effect that's included in Logic. So first of all, what I've done here is I've made a new session and I have an instrument track here that I put an EXS24 on. And on the EXS24, I loaded up the Steinway Grand Piano 2 preset. So I just clicked on this and then go to Factory, Acoustic Pianos, and Steinway Grand Piano 2 if you want to use the same preset as me doing this. Next, what I did is I put down some MIDI. I put down a C key, an E key, a G key, and then a C major chord. And I did that 2 times. And the reason I did that 2 times is because the first section I made have a constant velocity of 30, and the second section I made have a constant velocity of 80, just so we could hear the different velocities and how the velocity processor affected those differently. So first of all, before we get into the MIDI effect, let's just listen to see what this sounds like so we know what this sounds like without any MIDI effects on it. So that's what that sounds like. You can hear the difference in the velocities. I made it a rather large difference just so it was easier to tell as we're doing the velocity processing. So next we're going to load up the MIDI effects. So we just click on the MIDI effects box and we go down to velocity processor and just open that up. And next we'll have a dialog box that looks like a compressor. And then we have some basic knobs and things like that. And this is the default, what it opens up. So going over some of the parameters, first of all, the thing I want to cover is this MIDI effect has 3 different modes. You can see the mode here. We're on compressor/expander mode right now, and there's also a value/range mode and an add/scale mode. So that's something to keep in mind. We'll go over each of these modes when we get to them. Next, we have these 2 buttons that are note on and note off. It depends on when it's processing the MIDI notes. Note on is just when the note is pressed. Note off is when the note's released. Typically, it's on note on. That's the default setting. That's what I'm going to leave it at for right now. So moving on, what is this going to do? So if we turn down our threshold and bump up our ratio, it's going to compress the velocity. So without the velocity processor active, our MIDI sounds like this. So now when we turn it on, it's going to sound like this. Now, I made a lot of compression happen here, so it was easier to tell. But as you could tell, the lower one wasn't affected too much, but the harder velocity one, the one that was at 80 velocity originally, it was much quieter. It was at a much even velocity with the first C major chord. So this is just a basic compressor expander that, instead of compressing the audio signal or the gain, it's actually compressing the velocity of the notes that you're playing. So that's what that does. This threshold knob it determines where the threshold happens on a range from 1 to 127. It's relative to the MIDI values when it comes to velocity. Next, we have a ratio, which is the same as any compressor. You can have as low as 0.125 all the way up to 8. And then next we have just a makeup gain, which the makeup gain is actually a makeup velocity knob, which it makes up dependent on the velocity MIDI values again, all the way from -126 to 126. So that's something to keep in mind. You also have this auto knob here, which it automatically adjusts the makeup gain for you, depending on how you set the compressor. Moving on to the next mode, we have a value/range mode. Now, the value/range mode is cool. It's much simpler than the than the first mode. The value mode, it determines what value you're going to have the notes play at. It's as simple as that. So if I had the value at 1, everything's going to be playing at 1 velocity. So you can see the two chords were the same. Remember, this is the lower velocity chord, and then this is the higher velocity chord here. And both of them sounded the exact same because we had the value set to 1. Now if we bumped it up to, say, 70, let's do 70, this is what will happen. So now it's playing both chords at a velocity of 70. So that's the value. If you want a nice even velocity throughout your entire track, that's an easy way to do it rather than having to adjust the velocities of each individual key or each individual note. Excuse me. And next on this one, we have a range, which we have these two sliders here. We've seen things similar to this in previous lessons. So this is just the minimum range knob or slider, excuse me, and then this is the maximum range slider. So we could just set a value between the minimum and maximum, top being the minimum again and bottom being the maximum, and then it'll only play MIDI in between those different velocities. So we have, this one's at 30 and this one's at 80. So if I put it to, let's say, a max of 50, we're going to have this one be its default because it's 30, and this one's going to be lowered to 50 because of the range is set to a max of 50. So I'll just listen to the second chord real quick without the velocity processor on and see what that sounds like. So now if we turn it on, and I'm actually going to lower this a little bit more, I'm going to lower it to 40 here, and we play that same chord that has the original velocity of 80, it'll sound like this. It's much softer because the max velocity that it's allowing is 40. So since this is above the max, it's just going to the max by default. And listening to the whole thing, this chord will be the same with or without it's on. So that was with it off, and then with the velocity processor on, this is what the first chord sounds like. It sounds exactly the same since the velocity of 30 that these notes have is in the range of 1 to 40 that we've set here. So that's something cool that's in the value/range mode. You can set either a specific value that you want every note to be, or you can have a range that you want the notes to fall in between. So that's very useful. The last one is the add/scale mode. So what this does is the scale slider, it determines the scale of the velocity dependent on how hard it was originally played. For example, right now the default option is 50%, so everything's going to be playing at half of its original velocity. So this will be playing at 15, and this will be playing at 40. So this is what it sounds like, again, without the velocity processor on. And this is what it sounds like with the velocity processor on. So it's playing at half the velocity of the original notes. And then depending on where you move the scale, it'll, play based on your original velocity. If we had it at 100%, it'd play at the original velocity. Nothing would change. If we had it at, 200%, it'd be playing at double the velocity. I'll just play the first chord at 200% because the second chord would be a super high velocity and that might hurt our ears. So remember that chord had a velocity of 30 originally. So without the velocity processor on, it sounds like this. It's quite a difference that the scale knob can make. I'm going to just set it back to 50. And the next slider, it's the last slider, it's an add slider, which it adds a certain value to the velocity. So you can add, for example, we'll put this at 100 actually, just so we have the default value. So by default, again, I'm just going to work with the first chord on this one. But by default, we have the velocity at 30 for this C major chord at the beginning here. So if I added, say, 50 velocity, it's going to have a velocity of 80 for this first chord. So it's super simple stuff. It's just some basic math, really, with the addition and the scale. But it's definitely useful. Also, you can, like I've said before, you can also subtract. So it goes from minus 126 all the way to plus 126. Excuse me. So if I subtracted 40 from the velocity and I played this second chord here, which has an original velocity of 80. It'll be playing at 40 velocity rather than, if I turn this back off, rather than 80 velocity. But that about sums up the different modes of the velocity processor. I hope you learned something. This is definitely a very useful tool when it comes to MIDI, especially if you have a longer performance and there's some things that don't have balance. You can use the velocity processor to really smooth out the velocity changes in your MIDI. I hope you learned something though. Thank you for watching. Again, my name is William.